Okay. In my last video, there was a lot of complaints about how I gave my first impressions on this device, the Galaxy S23 Ultra, and I kind of gave my perspective as an iPhone user. And there were a lot of accusations saying basically that I was a little bit unfair to this phone, that I was looking for some angle, that I wasn't funny, all like this stuff. And we all know that's nonsense because I'm a funny guy. But listen, I take those complaints to heart, I guess. I'm not trying to look for an angle in this video. I'm just trying to give you my honest perspective as an iPhone user who has been using this phone for about the past week or so, or maybe even more than that at this point. Maybe it's been 2 weeks by the time I record this video. I'm very bad at time management. But yeah, so this Galaxy S23 Ultra, I have been using it and I have some thoughts on it. And I think that's okay. Like, if you're an Android user watching this video, you're not primarily an iPhone user, why not listen to what I have to say? Like, at the end of the day, I think, we are at a point where smartphones are so mature. You have so many great options, whether that's Android or iOS. And the differences are getting smaller and smaller, but there still are differences between a phone like the S23 Ultra and the iPhone 14 Pro. And that's kind of what I want to talk about in this video. I want to go over my experience as an iPhone user using the S23 Ultra. But I know, you Samsung fans, you're already watching this going, this guy's wearing an Apple Watch Ultra, he's an Apple sheep, he's biased. You know what? I'll make it, I'll do it for you. I'll take off the Apple Watch Ultra. It pains me to do it. What if I have a heart-related problem as I record this video because I'm so nervous? But I'm taking off the Apple Watch Ultra. That's right, you could see the tan lines from me wearing an Apple Watch every single day of my life. You like that pale skin. Yeah, you like it. It sees no sunlight. You disgust me. You know what? I know what your next complaint is. There's a Mac Mini back here. It has a freaking Apple logo on it. You can't stand to look at this, can you? It disgusts you. It shakes you to your very core. Well, you know what? We don't need the Mac Mini. All right? There's another one. Oh my God. We don't need this either. Let's get to it. Okay, so like I said, I've been using like the S23 Ultra for like the past 2 weeks now. And the first thing we got to talk about is the design, right? Like, this is a very different design than the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The iPhone 14 Pro Max has very flat stainless steel edges, and these are still kind of flat. Honestly, like, it's actually interesting. Like, yeah, both phones are flat. You can kind of both like stand them up if you want to do that. But there's a little bit more curvature to the S23 Ultra, and I think that's kind of good and bad. So the good thing is, I do think for a big phone, this is a big phone, 6.8 inches, a little bit bigger than the 14 Pro Max, it is kind of comfortable to hold in your hand like this. Having it a little bit more curved just feels a little bit more ergonomic in the hand, and that's a good thing when you're carrying such a big phone. The premium feel of this phone is excellent. Like, for like the longest time, especially back in the day, right? Like, iPhones always felt premium. A lot of Android phones felt pretty cheap. We are long past those days, right? Like, this is a very premium feeling phone. The build quality is excellent. The frosted glass on the back is very smooth. All that stuff, so good. The camera bumps even, I don't know. I don't know if I like this or not. Like, at times I look at the iPhone 14 Pro and I'm like, okay, that's the right way to do the camera system. But at first I kind of went, this is kind of ugly. But the more I look at it, the more I go, it's kind of clean not having a separate bump, right? Like, it's kind of clean just having these lenses in a row. It kind of looks weird because there's so many of them, but it is a clean design. And I do give Samsung some credit here for this design. I think it's very clean, very minimalistic. I think this is probably like one of their cleanest designs yet for a phone. So I haven't been using the S23 Ultra with a case, and it just is very slippery. So the more curvature to that means that when you're holding it in your hands like this, like, if you don't really grip it, it starts kind of like sliding out of your hands immediately. Just the sides are very slippery, the back is very slippery, and a strange complaint here, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm just absolutely crazy, the display itself, the coating on the display for the S23 Ultra is very slippery. I feel like it's more slippery than my iPhone. Something with the coating here for the fingerprints or the glare, I just feel like is a little bit extra slippery, or maybe it's even the way the display is shaped or angled that is causing it to just feel so very slippery in my hands. And that goes beyond just like holding it. Another thing I found when using the S23 Ultra is that, yes, it has this S Pen over here. But one of the problems I've had with the S Pen is that because the phone display is so slippery, I don't really get any tactile response when I'm using the S Pen. So my handwriting is normally pretty bad, but on the S23 Ultra, I feel like it's just even worse. Now, granted, we are working with a pretty small display here. My hands are pretty shaky, but that slippery display, I feel like goes against how you would want to really use a stylus on this phone, and it's just a little bit too slippery for me to comfortably write with this S Pen. But that doesn't mean everything is bad with the S Pen. There are actually some pretty good uses that I appreciate as an iPhone owner. So I think while I didn't find writing or handwriting particularly useful, and don't forget, I really don't handwrite anymore nowadays. I usually just type. I found that using this as a precision input for things like editing photos was actually really useful. Because your fingers aren't that precise. So if you're trying to move sliders, if you're trying to erase things in Lightroom or Photoshop or something like that, having that precise input tool is actually useful. So as a pro user, if you wanted to like edit photos on the go or something like that with a precision input, that's actually a really good use for a stylus. But let's talk more about this display. So listen, at this point again, when you're comparing iPhones and flagship Android phones, I mean, the displays on all these phones are so good now. They're all OLED displays. They all have, on the Pro model of the iPhone, they have the fast 120 hertz refresh rate. All that is true here with the S23 Ultra display. This is a great display. I think technically, this gets a little bit less bright than the 14 Pro Max. I didn't really find that a big deal. And I just felt like, yeah, it's a good display. It's an OLED display. The videos on this look absolutely great. And it's a bigger display too, which is nice. The differences I would say though, and again, we have to talk about the slight differences, is it's like a different design, right? So the 14 Pro has that infamous now dynamic island. The S23 Ultra has a just very simple little hole punch out here for the top of the camera. And that's good and bad, right? So a hole punch means it's less intrusive, so you technically get more screen real estate. But I will say, as a 14 Pro user, getting used to the interactions I have with my dynamic island, I kind of miss that. I kind of miss having those quick shortcuts on the S23 Ultra. But I will praise the S23 Ultra in another category, speakers. I always thought Android phones kind of skimped on speakers in some departments, at least the last time I used them. But this thing, I think, goes head to head against the iPhone in the speaker department. The speakers on this are very loud and they are very clear. And yeah, I can listen to podcasts or even some music on this, just using this, not hooking up to an external speaker, right? It's not gonna be better than an external speaker, but it's passable. And that's a great thing for a phone. So the speakers on this, good job, Samsung. Okay, let's talk a little bit about performance now. So this does have the latest Snapdragon chip in it. It's actually clocked higher too from what I read, so it has more performance. And, you put it side by side against iPhone benchmarks, like I did the Geekbench 6 benchmark, which had a new benchmark. There was some controversy with it. It wasn't optimized and Samsung optimized it. Long story short, the iPhone still scored higher. But again, it's just a benchmark. I don't really think that matters all too much. All I can say is that day-to-day performance with this device has felt very similar to my iPhone. Opening apps, performance, if I played a game or something like that, I really didn't notice any lag or slowdown generally with using the user interface. Now, that would be app dependent. I would say the areas where it kind of starts to be worse than the iPhone for me is with the apps themselves not being necessarily optimized. I would say that if you're using a lot of third-party apps like a Twitter or maybe even an Instagram or something like that, generally I found that the responsiveness of these apps, especially when I put them side by side, scrolling on Twitter between iPhone and the S23 Ultra, it was just smoother on the iPhone. So I would say app experience overall is generally better on the iPhone still. There are exceptions to that though, on the YouTube app. I use YouTube all the time, right? You're watching this on YouTube, so thank you. YouTube on the S23 Ultra is better than the iPhone, right? So I'm being fair here. One of the things I like about YouTube, especially on Android phones, is that say you're clicking a link on Twitter and you open up the YouTube app on iOS, it would open up a web browser in Twitter. Then you'd have to click on the Safari web browser, and then you'd have to click on a little button that says open this in YouTube. When you do this on Android, it bypasses all that. You click on the link, it opens it in YouTube. So things like that, again, I like better when I'm using an Android phone. I would say the worst optimization I've encountered so far, though, with the S23 Ultra is during Lightroom. I had to enter my Adobe password, and I just never have seen this on a phone before. Like anytime I went to go enter my password, the keyboard lagged. I reclosed the app, I tried this multiple times, and the keyboard optimization, whatever is going on with this software, and I know like Samsung like advertises like this, you can like edit photos in Lightroom and all this stuff. Like it's like a partnered app, right? Entering a password was like hard to do. Like I kept misentering my password. I had to do it very slowly because the keyboard was lagging in that app. So there's certain things like that with Android where the polish is just off. Things that I don't really ever run into on iOS. Still on sometimes, even as we're sitting here in 2023 with a flagship, the fastest Android phone, just because developers don't seem to target their apps as much for Android, you can run into some weird optimization problems like that. But one thing I don't have any nitpicks about is the battery life on this thing. This thing has excellent battery life. I have not been able to kill this in a day of using it. It is just stellar. So you get a lot of settings with Samsung phones, or I guess any Android phones, right? Like you could go set the resolution on it. You can set like the refresh rate. When this came out of the box, it was set to like HD resolution. I quickly changed that to the full Quad HD experience. So this is running on the max resolution. It's got the full refresh rate on. It's got auto brightness on, right? And I am getting about like 8 hours of screen on time, I would say on average. And yeah, that's plenty for me. The battery life feels very similar to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. You know, maybe at times even a little bit better. I'm not sure. My 14 Pro Max is obviously a little bit older than this phone. This is a brand new battery, so it's always hard to judge when you just get a brand new battery, because any phone you get that gets a brand new battery, it's usually like, oh, the battery's so great. But this is a good battery. Yeah, you can abuse this phone all day long, and you should be fine. All right, let's get to the end, right? Let's talk about the camera system, the thing every person fights about nowadays. Camera. There's a lot to go over with this camera system. I don't want to make this too long and too complex, but let's try and tackle this together. So let's start with the main camera, the 12 megapixel sensor, not using any of the higher resolution modes. It takes good photos. The regular 12 megapixel mode, the bin down photo, the thing that most people are going to be using when they use this camera, it takes good photos, and I overall like the photos. Like if we're comparing them against the iPhone 14 Pro, the photos look very similar. You have to really nitpick on photos at this point between flagship Android phones and flagship iPhones. But yeah, that's the world we're living in, so I do have to nitpick, right? Like I have to look at the small details and try and kind of give you the differences between these phones, and I did notice them. Even though they are small, I noticed them. I'm not saying this camera system's bad. I'm not even saying that maybe you might prefer the way photos look on the iPhone, or maybe you'll prefer the way photos look on the S23 Ultra, right? There's a lot of personal preference at this point, but there are differences. So overall, I found like things like exposure, all that stuff with HDR, both phones do a good job. But the S23 Ultra for me, I would say like if you, on the regular 12 megapixel mode, if you like zoomed in on the edges, I would say it loses a little bit more detail, at least in some of the photos I took compared to the iPhone. Like look at the sign right here on the S23 Ultra. It's a little bit more blurry compared to the 12 megapixel photo on the 14 Pro. And I also think it does weird things with skin tones in particular. So I didn't think there was any beauty mode enabled on the S23 Ultra. I know sometimes there's like a beauty mode enabled on Samsung phones. I looked through all the settings. I'm pretty sure there's no beauty mode enabled. And I took a photo, just some, photos, snapshots of me. And like the S23 Ultra was trying to like over whiten my face or add some like it was trying to get rid of the natural redness in my face, trying to make me look more handsome, I guess. But yeah, it was just a weird effect. It didn't look natural. Like I looked at these photos, I looked at the ones I took on my iPhone, and I asked people around me, I go, is this what I look like? And they go, no, you don't look like that. So something was weird here with the skin tone processing on the S23 Ultra, where I preferred it more on my iPhone 14. But hey, there's things the Samsung phone does better, right? So one of those, and I think this would be obvious to most people, the zoom on this thing. It's really good. So both phones can go up to like a 3x zoom and all that, and you can probably make like the same comparisons, but the S23 has like a huge edge because it gets a 10 times zoom. So, and it's a natural 10 times zoom. It's not digitally cropped in or anything like that. So you take a 10 times photo with the S23 Ultra, you take a digitally cropped in 10 times photo with the iPhone 14 Pro, you're gonna get way more detail on the S23 Ultra. The photo's gonna look way better every single time. The zoom on this thing is really good. In my initial video, I said, was the zoom a gimmick? And I don't think the 10 times zoom is a gimmick. I don't even think like digitally cropping into 30x is a gimmick. Like you can get some really good, usable 30x photos, provided you have good lighting. Like if you take this in low light at night with the 30x, it looks awful, but provided you have good lighting, you're gonna get some really nice looking photos, and way better than anything the iPhone can pull off. But like the 100x, right? Like I said, like was the 100x a gimmick? At least in my testing, mostly a gimmick. So I don't think you're really gonna get any usable photos that you're gonna wanna show off to people other than like a party trick of like, hey, look how far I can zoom in, right? Like, but if you actually look at the photos, they look bad. The 100 times zoomed in photos just look bad. They're artifacty. There's so much processing that Samsung does on their end. Like when you take the photo, you can see it and it's all like a blurry mess. And then all of a sudden it gets like sharper because there's just so much processing that kicks in to try and get you a usable photo. And it's mostly bad. The only usable area I will say where you actually like you can kind of appreciate this is, and I've seen people mention this in my comments and they're kind of right. Let's say there's like a faraway sign that you're trying to read, and like if you have bad eyesight or even like just the sign's far away, like there's like a parking sign, you're trying to like, when do I get a ticket if I park here? You can zoom in, right? You get to that 100 times zoom, and because it's sharpening things and because I'm sure like the computational algorithms can kind of like decipher the text on what you're reading, the text fills in like pretty well. So even if you're taking like 100 times photo, you can kind of get like text that is readable, and that is useful. So you might not necessarily get like a usable photo, but in terms of versatility of using this as like a tool to read things that are far away, don't knock that, iPhone users. That's actually pretty useful as a feature. And overall, like as an iPhone user, do I want a 10x zoom or just a higher zoom, like a 6x or an 8x on my iPhone? Yes, I think the 3x at this point on the iPhone is redundant when you have that new 2x mode. And as an iPhone user, the 10x isn't a gimmick. I appreciate it. Credit to Samsung. They do it better. They do zoom photos better than the iPhone. I should also mention some other things, right? So on the 14 Pro this year, one of my favorite new features was the Pro RAW mode. So you can get a 48 megapixel photo with like Pro RAW data. You get like a really big file size for a photo, and you can get a lot of detail out of that photo. You can edit it, and then they're really great, right? Like it's a great tool to get more detail out of your photo, get more flexibility when editing it, and to get higher resolution photos. Well, Samsung takes it a step farther, right? Number one, you can get a 50 megapixel mode, right? That's 2 more megapixels than the 14 Pro. And at the maximum, you can get a 200 megapixel photo. Ultimately, though, there's good and bad to this. So on the 50 megapixel, I would say the detail is very similar to what you would get on a 48 megapixel iPhone photo. But the 200 megapixel mode, I would say the Samsung photo just provides more detail, right? It's using a 200 megapixel sensor. You can crop in like a ton, and you can still retain detail more than what you can get on the 48 megapixel sensor of the 14 Pro. But ultimately, what photos did I like better compared to the systems when taking them on both the 50 and the 200 mode? I preferred the iPhone, right? There's just something, again, with these photos. The way Samsung, there's some processing on these photos that isn't happening with the computational Pro RAW photos on the 14 Pro or something like that. I just feel like the 14 Pro with the exposure, with contrast, with lighting, everything, something just looks better with them defaultly out of the box. So, you would get better resolution on the S23 Ultra, right? That's a pro of the photo. Maybe you can edit that to get something you like. Maybe you like the default photos. Now I want to re-say everything because I feel like I've been leaning more towards iPhone. You'll probably be like, another Apple sheep. This isn't a bad camera system. It's a good camera system. If I had this on my phone, I wouldn't necessarily be like, oh, I don't like this camera system. It's very good. Like when I'm using it alone, I don't really notice these differences. When I just put it side by side, I'm like, okay, I can see these differences between the iPhone. It's a great camera system. There's some things it does better, right? The zoom on this way better. But like I think like the ultimate test is if I could keep my iPhone, the hardware, iOS, all that, and if I had to swap the camera system with the S23 Ultra, and that's the only change. Like I would have to take the full camera system on the S23 Ultra and put on my iPhone. Would I do that at this point? Like, camera quality, video quality, all that stuff, all that in combination, Would I put that on my iPhone? No. I think ultimately the combination, even though this doesn't have the best zoom, the combination of photos and videos to my preference, and then the options you get with the video formats and stuff like that, I would still pick the 14 Pro. So that's just me. Now listen, this is a long video, but I have to conclude it. I know I didn't go over everything, right? Like switching over from an iPhone to an Android phone. There's so much to cover all the time. I can't cover possibly everything. We'd be here for like 3 hours, I mean, probably more, right? So many differences between these phones. Still, even though phones are getting similar, and even though like almost every phone you run into at this point, at least at the flagship level, are really good, there's still a lot of differences switching over from iOS to Android. And probably the biggest one is the Apple ecosystem, which I really didn't even delve into in this video. So ultimately, I got to be honest with you. I'm an honest guy. I'm always honest with my audience. Am I switching to the S23 Ultra? I'm not. Ultimately, I like my iPhone better for a lot of reasons. Part of those reasons is the Apple ecosystem, right? Like I like having my AirDrop. I like being able to, connect to my Mac and stuff like that. I like the AirPods ecosystem. I like having my Apple Watch. I like it all, right? Like the ecosystem. I know people say Samsung has an ecosystem. Maybe if I went all in on Samsung, but I don't think there's an equal replacement on Samsung's side for the Mac, right? Like the Mac is ultimately probably the biggest ecosystem play for me. And I look at Windows and all that stuff, like, and the Galaxy tabs, that's definitely one of the big ones, right? With the ecosystem. Macs, I'm a Mac guy, and that would be the hardest part for me, probably. But listen, ultimately, I like my blue bubbles. My time as a green bubble, it's coming to an end. My time as a green bubble is over, okay? The green bubble era is over. I'm going back to my iPhone. That's just how it is. I'm slapping back on the Apple Watch. The Apple Watch is coming back on my wrist. Okay, Samsung fans, I am sorry to offend you. I am sorry. Write all the angry YouTube comments, send me all the angry letters. I'm prepared for it. I've been practicing for this moment. I've been training. So send me all your hate mail, send me all your angry comments. I don't care. I'm sticking with my iPhone 14 Pro. Is this a good phone? It's a good phone. If you like Android, you'll probably love this phone. Another thing I forgot to mention is it's kind of expensive phone, right? $1,200 starting. At least I can say for the Pro Max, it's $1,099 starting. So look at that. Apple's actually cheaper for once. Oh my gosh. But yeah, it's still a good phone. It's still a good phone. If you're an Android user, you'll probably like it, right? You'll probably love it. But me, I'm going back to the embraces of my iPhone, and I'm not apologizing for it. Hope you liked the video. If you did, give me a like. If you want to see more, make sure you're subscribed, especially all the Android people. You can subscribe. It's fine. And yeah, time as the blue bubble has emerged. I'm good to go. I'll see you in the next video. I'm putting back up the Mac Minis too, This is the house that Steve Jobs built.